Good evening and welcome to the read-in. So I'm reading tonight from my novel Painting Away Regrets, which came out 2 years ago, but it is still brand new and fresh. And so I'm delighted that you're here to listen to it. And I'm reading from, let me just tell you a little bit about the novel before I get into it. It's set primarily in California, but it's also set in Jamaica, and it's set a little bit in Uganda. The protagonists, Christine and Donald, are married. In fact, they met at UC Berkeley in law school. And this section that I'm reading, which is called Nyabingi Rhythm, and Nyabingi is a Jamaican term, which, and the protagonist, Christine, who should not in any way be confused with me, is Jamaican. And there are lots of different rhythms that this novel takes on. So it takes on blues, it takes on jazz, it takes on calypso. Because partly what I'm saying is that as African people in the diaspora, we are familiar with all of these rhythms, and all of these rhythms govern our lives. Anyway, this section is set in California, specifically in Emeryville, and it deals with Christine, who is the protagonist of the novel. And for those of you who have not yet read the novel, and I know you're going to want to buy it and read it, Painting Away Regrets, it is the story of this couple who fell in love and got married, had children, and then unfortunately, like so many marriages, they went their separate ways in terms of expectations and demands, and are going through a terrible divorce. But in addition to that story, which is a very popular and a very, if in some instance, very common story now, the book actually does dual stories. So that's the one story. The other story of the voice of the Orishas. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Orisha tradition comes from Nigeria, Yoruba tradition specifically. And my premise of this novel is that the Orishas are really the ones who are in charge and are calling the shots unbeknownst to Christine and Donald, her husband. And so there are those voices in it. The novel is really quite straightforward, and I think those of you, when you hear this section, can very well readily identify with the character and some of the emotional experiences that the character undertakes. So let me just read. Nyabingi Rhythm. Somehow the inevitable journey looms, and although you might be reluctant to face it, that is the only path open to you. Christine parked at the Emeryville Marina, strode to the western end, and climbed the rocks. From there she could survey both the San Francisco and Golden Gate bridges. She stood looking out to sea like a sailor left ashore, hoping another ship would come to the rescue. But she knew there was no one to deliver her, that all she had was herself. True, she had a loving family and dear friends who would always come to her aid, but this was something that she alone would have to work out. She scrambled down the rocks to where the waves splashed gently against the shore. She found a spot where the rocks formed a natural chair, and there she sat out of view of the people walking or jogging on the path above. She threw her head back, closed her eyes, and allowed the rays of the sun to penetrate her body, unfreeze her blood, and open up her heart. She didn't know when the tears began, but she allowed them to flow, dripping onto the rock. Her chest heaved and her arms trembled. How had she gotten here? Nothing had prepared her for this path. How long had she been out of control? Yeah, could she ever find her way back to someplace wholesome, sane? Why hadn't anyone prepared her for the anguish? How come she hadn't had the vaguest notion of how enormous the pain could be? She righted her head, looked out at a sailboat passing, and then she felt as if a gigantic ball was trying to force its way up her chest. She opened her mouth, and a scream came out and echoed around her head. Whoa! she hollered, spitting the ball out of her mouth, and the pain she had been feeling in her chest for several months began to slowly subside. "Why-oh!" she moaned, feeling faint. Her mouth tasted bitter, and she leaned forward to spit out phlegm. And again the cry, the anguish, "Why-oh!" To a friend who had asked, she said she could not remember any good times between Donald and herself. She assumed her memory had erased any there had been because she did not want to remember. But if she allowed herself to remember, then perhaps she would not have hated him so intensely, would not have expended so much energy plotting and rehearsing his death. Was her memory as cruel as she had been? Had there been no room to store the good times with him along the awful times? This was not a photo album. Besides, she already destroyed all the pictures of them together. It was done. She needed to get on with the here and now. Damn it! Why must she return to the past? Who gives a bloody damn? She shouted at the waves and then started to giggle uncontrollably. Inside her head, she talked gently to herself like a mother to a hurt, screaming child, trying to calm herself down, urging herself to take back control. She had been flirting with a nervous breakdown for the past 2 years, had briefly given way to it, but now was not the time to give in to it again. She readjusted her body against the rocks and sat quietly staring out to space. 2 dogs passed each other on the path, barking aggressively. Christine could hear their owners trying to calm them. After that, she heard the sound of heavy feet and strained breathing, followed by children chanting a rhythm, their voices quickening and rising as they got to its end. A pelican swooped down to catch a fish. Then her attention was captured by a trail of ant on the rock below her feet. Her hands pushed against the grainy rock, warming under the sun. The salty smell of the sea sprayed her nostril. Her senses were awakened. So that's that section when she goes off to, in a sense, regroup herself. Christine, as I read before, is flirting with a nervous breakdown. And now this other section, and I'll read a small part and then I'll entertain a few questions. She's reflecting, she's still at the Berkeley Marina, and she's reflecting on how they met. A fling was what she had in mind. She had spent an intense year completing her law degree and was studying to take the bar exam in addition to writing educational curricula to augment her grant. She had no time for romance, and since she had terminated a going-nowhere relationship before her final year in law school, it was undeniable that by the end of the academic year, she was extremely horny. However, with definite plans for her career and her life, a steady long-term relationship was not in her plans. She wanted no distraction before passing the bar and entering into the job market. Something serious would slow her down and complicate her plans. Although her biological clock was ticking, she had time. A fling, hot sex. Although she was partial to the intellectual type, for the summer he could be average, though he had to be attractive, have a good body. He didn't need to have money except for his half of whatever they did outside the bed. She didn't want any man to think she was obligated because he bought her a meal or took her to a concert. The first time she saw him was in a cafe near the campus where she often went to sketch when she felt stressed. It was always noisy and busy, and the models, other customers, were free. He'd been standing outside talking to another guy directly in front of the window near where she sat sketching, and his intense gestures caught her attention. He and his friends must have talked for 20 minutes before they finally came inside, and as chance would have it, the table beside her became free just as they approached it. Christine heard enough of their conversation to surmise that, like her, they were both law students, though he would be graduating with a doctorate in law and was planning to pursue teaching and research. She had realized with slight embarrassment that she was eavesdropping on their conversation rather than sketching. So when someone asked to join her at the table, she closed her pad, said the table was free, gathered up her things. In her haste to depart, she left her jacket slung over the chair, and Donald came running behind her, holding it out like an offering. And I'll stop there and entertain a few questions. So, as I said, this is from my novel, Painting Away Regrets, and it's available online, and it's published by Peepal Tree Press in England, and so I invite you to get it. It's also a good piece of literature to teach. I'm obviously self-promoting, and I think that's what any good writer needs to do. So, did someone have a question? So, does anyone have any questions? Yes.
Can you say a little something about Donald and Christine's relationship?
Sure. So Donald and Christine, as the little excerpt I read, you just heard, met in law school. She is from Jamaica, he's an African-American man, and they had this amazing physical attraction. I think at the beginning both of them knew that they were not necessarily for each other, but their physical attraction and the sex was so great, they decided to just kind of, they took off full launch, so to speak, and they got married. And I think there is or was a deep love between them, but as the marriage progressed, as children progressed and they found different rearing styles, she had different expectations in terms of how she wanted her life to look and what kinds of things she wanted to do. So, you know, all of those things created divide, and it got to be such that they, you know, it became impossible for them to live together. Okay. So thank you very much, and again, I have books there. If you purchase your copy, I'll be very happy to sign it for you. And if you are not purchasing your copy today, I invite you to go online and find the book at Amazon.com or Peepal Tree Press. Thank you so much for coming.